Welcome to The Curious Case, where every tale unfolds like a whispered secret on a foggy night. Today we invite you to dive into a gripping new mystery featuring the astute and ever-curious Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's beloved amateur detective. Get cozy, grab your favorite cup of tea, and let's unravel this thrilling enigma together. And before we begin, don't forget to share where you're tuning in from. It's always a delight to know where our community of mystery lovers gathers. Now let's get started. Miss Marple and the enigma of the lost portrait. It had been years since Miss Marple last joined the Garden Lane Reading Society, a modest group that had once been the heart of St. Mary Mead's social life. The society had dissolved quietly, like morning mist fading under the sun, after a scandalous theft shattered its harmony. So when Miss Marple received a neatly folded invitation card from the society's new hostess, Lady Primrose, she couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. Why now? And why Lady Primrose, a woman who had never shown the slightest interest in such humble gatherings? Miss Marple pondered this as she folded the card with care, her mind already piecing together fragments of the past. Arriving at Primrose Hall, Miss Marple was greeted by a lively room, filled with familiar faces and a few newcomers. Among them was a striking figure, Mr. Felix Crowe, an art historian recently settled in the village. His presence seemed to ignite a peculiar tension, noticeable even among the society's most composed members. As discussions of literature and local happenings flowed, Felix's probing questions became increasingly unsettling. "Has anyone seen the old portrait from the reading room?" he asked, his eyes glinting with a peculiar intensity. A ripple of unease spread through the room. The portrait depicting the hall's original owner had vanished during the society's last gathering, years ago. The theft had never been resolved, and the group's reputation had been stained ever since. As the evening wore on, Felix continued to weave his inquiries through casual conversations, skillfully steering topics back to the portrait's disappearance. Lady Primrose, visibly uncomfortable, tried to change the subject, but her hands trembled as she poured tea. Observing from her corner, Miss Marple noted how Felix seemed less interested in the portrait itself, and more in the people who might have had access to it. It was almost as if he were measuring reactions, searching for a flicker of guilt or a slip of the tongue, when a sudden draft caused the heavy drapes to sway, revealing a shadowed figure at the window. A collective gasp filled the room. But when Lady Primrose rushed to check, no one was there, just the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, sensed that the portrait's mystery was only part of the story. It wasn't just about the painting, but something hidden within it, a secret long buried, perhaps linked to the hall's storied past. As the guests dispersed into the night, Miss Marple remained behind, her mind piecing together the threads of conversation. Just as she was about to leave, she overheard Lady Primrose speaking in hushed tones to Felix. "You promised to keep it quiet," she whispered, fear etched into her voice. "If they find out what's behind the canvas." Felix silenced her with a sharp look, his voice low and menacing. "Some truths can't stay hidden forever." Miss Marple tightened her grip on her coat, knowing that whatever the truth was, it was far darker than just a missing portrait. As she walked into the misty night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Felix wasn't searching for a painting, he was hunting for a secret that could ruin lives. And in the quiet of the village, shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if echoing the whisper of something sinister, just waiting to be uncovered. The afternoon sun bathed the quaint village of St. Mary Mead in a warm golden light, but within the confines of the old stone hall, the atmosphere felt undeniably colder. The sewing circle had gathered as usual, a patchwork of chatter and laughter filling the room. Mrs. Hartley, the group's newest member, stood apart from the others, examining an ornate silver locket that lay on the windowsill, as if abandoned in haste. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with her neat embroidery, couldn't help but notice the way Mrs. Hartley's fingers traced the delicate engraving, a single intricate rose intertwined with a serpent. Just then, the soft hum of conversation wavered as Mrs. Hartley spoke, almost as if testing the waters. "It's remarkable," she mused aloud, her voice light but purposeful. "This locket reminds me of the old Wilkins tragedy. Such a dreadful business. I suppose it must be nearly 20 years now since the girl vanished without a trace. A stillness fell over the room. Mrs. Bantry, usually the heart of the circle's gossip, paused mid-stitch, her face betraying a flicker of something that wasn't quite shock, more like a careful masking of unease. Mrs. Pettigrew, whose hands rarely faltered, dropped her needle, the soft clang against the wooden floor seeming unnaturally loud. Miss Marple didn't move, but her sharp eyes darted between the women, noting the subtle shift in posture, the way glances were exchanged without words. Mrs. Hartley, seemingly oblivious to the ripple her words had caused, continued thoughtfully, "My grandmother used to say the house was cursed after that. The girl's father sealed her room, said it would stay untouched until she returned. People whispered that the family was cursed long before that night, something about a betrayal, and a secret hidden in the very walls of Wilkins Manor." The silence stretched, taut and uneasy. Mrs. Bantry cleared her throat, forcing a brittle smile. "Yes, well, that's all just old superstition, isn't it? Best not to dwell on such gloomy tales. After all, we're here to enjoy each other's company, not resurrect ancient ghosts." But the room remained tense, the jovial mood shattered. Miss Marple, her hands never pausing in their rhythmic stitching, felt the pulse of tension weaving through the group. Mrs. Pettigrew glanced nervously at the locket, now lying abandoned on the table, as though it had brought something unwelcome with it. Just then, a draught stirred the lace curtains, and for a moment the room seemed almost to breathe, like the whisper of something long forgotten, creeping in through the cracks. As the group tried to resume their usual banter, Mrs. Hartley gave a small knowing smile, almost too faint to notice. Miss Marple caught it, however, and her instincts flared. This wasn't just casual curiosity. Mrs. Hartley's words had been deliberate, probing, like a hand testing for a weakness in a wall. As the afternoon wore on, conversations became stilted, and when the gathering finally broke up, Mrs. Bantry lingered, fussing with the tea things more than necessary. Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled, how her gaze kept drifting to the locket. Just as Miss Marple was about to leave, she caught the tail end of a whispered exchange between Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Pettigrew, near the doorway. "We can't let her dig into it," Mrs. Bantry hissed, her voice tight with panic. Mrs. Pettigrew's reply was just as anxious. "But if she finds out the truth, we're done for. We promised never to speak of it again, never." As Miss Marple slipped quietly into the evening air, her thoughts swirled with the hints and half-truths of the day. The Wilkins tragedy had long been considered a closed chapter, a sad tale buried under years of polite silence. But Mrs. Hartley's arrival seemed to have unsettled something far more insidious than mere gossip. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long creeping shadows, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if the truth had ever really been buried at all, or if it had just been waiting for the right moment to emerge, bringing with it the haunting echoes of a betrayal that had never truly faded away. As the clock struck 5, the old church bell echoed through the narrow streets of Windermere, signaling the end of another long, uneventful day, or so it seemed. In the dimly lit parlor of the Hastings Manor, a group of women gathered, their laughter mixing with the crackling of the fire, while they busied themselves with embroidery, their nimble fingers weaving delicate patterns into the fabric. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary sewing circle, a routine meeting of old friends sharing gossip and tea, but beneath the surface, something was different tonight. The usual warmth was absent, replaced by a tense, brittle energy that seemed to pulse through the room. At the heart of it all was Mrs. Eleanor Tremaine, an elegant yet imposing figure, who sat apart from the group, her eyes fixed on a faded portrait hanging above the mantelpiece, a portrait of the late Lady Hastings, whose tragic drowning 2 decades ago had left the manor shrouded in whispers. "I can't help but wonder," Eleanor spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through the soft murmur like a blade, "whatever happened to the Hastings daughter? They say she vanished the night her mother died." A chill swept the room, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Lowry, usually the most talkative, pressed her lips tightly together, her embroidery needle pausing mid-stitch. Even the fire seemed to dim, as if shrinking from Eleanor's work. "Best not to dwell on old tragedies," Mrs. Callahan replied, her voice strained and too quick. Eleanor didn't relent. "It's just odd, isn't it? Disappearing without a trace, leaving nothing behind but that music box. A nervous cough from Mrs. Harper broke the silence, but Eleanor continued, undeterred. They never did find her, you know, not a scrap of evidence, just the music box, playing that eerie lullaby over and over. At the mention of the melody, Mrs. Lowry visibly shuddered, dropping her needle. The soft clink as it hit the wooden floor seemed louder than a gunshot. Miss Beryl, the quietest of the group, looked up sharply, her knuckles white against the edge of her sewing frame. I heard Eleanor pressed on, lowering her voice as if sharing a scandalous secret, that someone saw a light in the old tower last night. They say it's haunted, you know, by the daughter's spirit, trapped and seeking justice. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Miss Beryl's eyes flickered with something like fear, or was it guilt? Mrs. Callahan's hand trembled, spilling tea onto her lap, but she barely noticed, her gaze fixed on the floor. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, as if nature itself couldn't bear the tension. Eleanor leaned back, satisfied, but Miss Beryl suddenly stood, her voice sharper than anyone had ever heard. "You're wrong," she whispered, eyes blazing. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, because it never really died. Some secrets don't haunt, they wait." As the fire hissed and crackled, the women stared at her, stunned. Eleanor's triumphant smirk faltered, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Miss Beryl turned back to her stitching, but the room was no longer the same. It had changed, tainted by old memories clawing their way back from the shadows. In the uneasy silence that followed, it became clear to everyone that Eleanor had pulled at a thread that might unravel more than just an old family mystery. The sewing circle at Hastings Manor was in full swing that rainy afternoon, the steady patter against the windows blending with the quiet hum of chatter and the soft click of knitting needles. Mrs. Bantry, the gracious host, rose to pour more tea while Mrs. Fanshawe, the newest member of the group, circulated a plate of freshly baked lemon biscuits. Their vibrant yellow color and sweet citrusy aroma filled the parlor, inviting the women to partake. Miss Hargreaves, known for her delicate palate, took one with a polite nod, nibbling its edge before dipping it into her steaming cup. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how Mrs. Fanshawe's gaze seemed to linger on Miss Hargreaves. No malice, no intent, just an odd flicker of tension, like a string pulled too tight. Moments later, the tranquility shattered as Miss Hargreaves let out a sudden strangled gasp, her teacup slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. Clutching her throat, she struggled to speak, but her words twisted into a rasping, desperate cough. Panic seized the room as Mrs. Hargreaves collapsed onto the floral settee, her face pale and slick with sweat. Mrs. Pettigrew, always timid, shrieked, while Mrs. Bantry rushed to fetch the doctor. The women crowded around, whispering prayers and questions, while Miss Marple bent down, gently pressing 2 fingers to the woman's wrist. No pulse. Miss Hargreaves was gone, and in that split second, the circle's light-hearted camaraderie dissolved into suspicion. The plate of lemon biscuits, now untouched, became the center of fearful glances. Mrs. Fanshawe, who had brought them, stood frozen, her hands quivering as she fumbled for a handkerchief. "I only thought," she stammered, but her words drowned in the murmurs accusing her of foul play. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her sharp eyes flicking from face to face, noting how Mrs. Fanshawe's distress seemed genuine, almost too genuine. One of the older women, Mrs. Carter, subtly pushed the plate away, her eyes fixed on the crumbs left by Miss Hargreaves. Amidst the clamor, Miss Marple caught a fleeting expression on Mrs. Pettigrew's face, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a hint of relief barely masked by her trembling hands. It was gone in a blink, but not before Miss Marple stored it in her mind, like a bookmark to revisit. As the local constable arrived, alerted by Mrs. Bantry's frantic call, he surveyed the scene with confusion, while Miss Marple discreetly examined the biscuit Miss Hargreaves had taken a bite from. A faint bitter smell lingered, almonds, cyanide. But why Mrs. Hargreaves, and why now in the presence of so many witnesses? Mrs. Fanshawe looked genuinely mortified, but something about the whole scene felt too theatrical, too deliberately chaotic. Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger didn't lie in the obvious suspect, but in the subtle currents of resentment and old grudges that had quietly festered in the circle. As the constable gathered statements, Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Pettigrew seemed unusually composed now, her earlier panic fading as attention shifted to Mrs. Fanshawe. It dawned on Miss Marple that sometimes the one who cries wolf is not the one who sets the trap. She watched as Mrs. Pettigrew straightened her shawl, her fingers deftly picking at a loose thread, and wondered just how much guilt could be hidden behind the guise of innocence. The rain outside pounded harder, as if washing away the pretense of civility, leaving behind only the bare, uncomfortable truth that danger often lurks in the most familiar faces. Miss Marple, sipping her now cold tea, resolved to dig deeper, for while death had taken Miss Hargreaves, it seemed betrayal had been brewing, long before the first biscuit was served. The rain drummed relentlessly against the windows of Maplewood Manor, casting a gloomy veil over the cozy gathering inside. The knitting club, led by the ever-gracious Mrs. Thorne, met every Thursday in the grand drawing-room, surrounded by the manor's faded portraits and antique trinkets. Tonight, however, a palpable tension hung in the air. Mrs. Davenport, the club's newest member, had brought a batch of homemade scones, golden brown, speckled with raisins, and still warm from the oven. As Mrs. Norris helped herself to one, complimenting the buttery aroma, her hands trembled slightly, a motion not lost on the observant Mrs. Baxter. Meanwhile, Miss Felicity, known for her discerning palate, took a careful bite, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Just as the conversation began to swell with tales of village gossip and the recent storm damage, Miss Felicity's teacup slipped from her grasp, shattering against the polished floor. Clutching her throat, her face flushed a deep crimson, she struggled to breathe. Panic erupted as Mrs. Thorne rushed to support her, but within moments, Miss Felicity had collapsed, her final breath leaving her lips in a soft wheezing rattle. Silence, heavy and stunned, wrapped itself around the group as they stared at the motionless figure sprawled on the rug. Mrs. Thorne whispered a prayer, while Mrs. Baxter, the first to regain her composure, hurried to fetch the constable. Mrs. Davenport, white as the lace collar around her neck, stammered an incoherent denial, insisting the scones were nothing unusual, just her grandmother's old recipe. Yet the suspicion had already rooted itself, sprouting dark glances and muttered accusations. Miss Everleigh, ever prone to dramatics, declared it murder, while Mrs. Norris dropped her half-eaten scone as though it had turned to poison in her hands. Through the commotion, Mrs. Baxter remained unnervingly calm, her keen eyes tracing the room, noting the sudden shift in demeanor from several women. It wasn't just the death that unnerved them, it was the reminder of something long buried. As the constable arrived, taking statements from the distraught ladies, Mrs. Baxter quietly examined the fallen scone. A faint, bitter scent lingered. Almonds, cyanide. But why would anyone want to kill Miss Felicity, the mildest of souls? Mrs. Davenport kept mumbling about her innocence, her words fragmented by fear, while Mrs. Norris whispered to Mrs. Thorne about an incident from years past, a scandal involving Miss Felicity and the late Mr. Thorne. Mrs. Baxter, however, was not convinced. The tension in the room didn't seem born of shock alone, but rather the stirring of old wounds and unresolved grudges. As the constable struggled to make sense of the conflicting testimonies, Mrs. Baxter approached the window, her thoughts coiling around the past. Maplewood Manor had seen its share of secrets, but few were spoken aloud. As the rain continued to pour, she recalled a hushed story from 2 decades prior, a bitter rivalry within the knitting circle, sparked by jealousy and betrayal. A woman named Eleanor Webb had vanished after an altercation with Miss Felicity, the details of which had been obscured by time and gossip. No one dared to mention it openly, but whispers lingered, suggesting Eleanor had been driven away, or were. As Mrs. Baxter pieced together fragments of memory, she noted how Mrs. Norris avoided eye contact with Mrs. Davenport, a fleeting moment that spoke volumes. The constable, growing frustrated with the muddled accounts, turned to Mrs. Baxter for clarity. Calmly, she proposed that the truth might lie, not just in the present, but in the long shadow of the past. Maplewood Manor, like all grand old places, harbored more than cobwebs. It held grudges and forgotten scandals. As the rainstorm outside intensified, Mrs. Baxter knew that to solve the present crime, she would need to unravel the knotted threads of old animosities, exposing the truth one stitch at a time. In the quaint village of Millstone, where secrets often hid beneath polished smiles and afternoon tea, a sudden death shattered the calm. Mrs. Edith Harwood, known for her impeccable scones and sharp tongue, was found lifeless at the Sewing Circle's weekly gathering, her fingers still curled around a half-eaten biscuit. As whispers rippled through the crowd, the inspector arrived, his presence casting a shadow over the once cheerful room. Mrs. Fanshawe, the newest member, looked pale and bewildered, her tray of freshly baked treats now the center of suspicion. The villagers eyed her cautiously, recalling how she had arrived only a few months earlier, claiming to be a distant relative of the late vicar, yet her presence had stirred an unease that no one could quite explain. Miss Marlowe, ever observant, noticed how Mrs. Fanshawe seemed to avoid eye contact, her hands trembling as she attempted to explain the biscuit recipe to the inspector. Some nodded sympathetically, while others exchanged wary glances, recalling a scandal that had long been buried. A young woman named Lillian Cartwright, who had vanished decades ago after a heated argument at the Sewing Circle. The affair had been brushed under the rug, labeled as a runaway case, but Miss Marlowe recalled how Lillian had been seen just once after her disappearance, by the old mill, arguing with someone in the shadows. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marlowe made her way to the vicarage, her instincts tingling with the familiar scent of an old mystery resurfacing. The vicar's wife greeted her warmly, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face when Miss Marlowe mentioned Lillian. Over tea, the vicar's wife hesitantly revealed how Lillian had been involved with a man from the village, a secret romance known only to a few. Miss Marlowe listened carefully, piecing together fragments of gossip and whispered accusations that had once flown like crows over Millstone. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marlowe considered the peculiar detail Mrs. Fanshawe had let slip earlier, that the recipe was handed down from her grandmother. It struck her as odd, since Mrs. Fanshawe had claimed to be new to the village, yet spoke of traditions as if they were her own. Digging deeper, Miss Marlowe visited the village archives, discovering an old family tree linking Lillian to the Fanshawe line. Suddenly, the motive became clear. Mrs. Fanshawe was not a distant relative of the vicar, but Lillian's daughter, returning to uncover the truth of her mother's disappearance. The next morning, Miss Marlowe invited Mrs. Fanshawe for tea, subtly guiding the conversation towards heritage and memories. As Miss Fanshawe unwittingly revealed more, her story started to unravel, her words stumbling when Miss Marlowe mentioned Lillian. At last, the truth spilled out. Lillian had planned to elope, but someone had threatened her, forcing her to flee. Mrs. Fanshawe had come back to find out who had driven her mother away, and why. Realizing the connection, Miss Marlowe turned her thoughts to Mrs. Harwood's death. Perhaps the poison had not been meant for her at all, but for Mrs. Fanshawe, someone trying to bury the past once more. Miss Marlowe's mind raced through the remaining members of the Sewing Circle, recalling subtle shifts in tone when Lillian's name surfaced. One name stood out, Mrs. Harper, the only one who had been overly friendly to Mrs. Fanshawe, yet subtly critical when discussing the past. That evening Miss Marlowe confronted Mrs. Harper, her calm demeanor hiding the sharpness of her words. At first Mrs. Harper dismissed the accusation, but under Miss Marlowe's unyielding gaze, she finally confessed. She had been the one to threaten Lillian years ago, fearing that the young woman would expose an affair with her husband. The guilt had gnawed at her, and when Mrs. Fanshawe began asking questions, fear took hold once again. The biscuits, meant to silence the daughter before she could uncover the truth, had tragically found the wrong victim. With the mystery laid bare, the village settled back into its routine, though the memory of Lillian's fate remained etched in Millstone's history. Mrs. Fanshawe, now free of the shadows that had loomed for years, chose to stay, rebuilding her roots where her mother once dreamed of a new beginning. As Miss Marlowe walked through the village square, she couldn't help but smile. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of clawing their way back to the surface. In the sleepy town of Ashford, where tales of the past blended seamlessly with the whispers of the present, a chilling discovery stirred old secrets from their grave. It began when the annual charity bake sale at the church hall took a grim turn. Amelia Wren, the respected yet reserved organist, was found collapsed behind the pulpit, her hands stained with jam and a faint, eerie smile etched on her face. As the villagers murmured in disbelief, the doctor pronounced her dead, poisoned it seemed, by her own preserves. Yet as the inspector delved deeper, it became clear that Amelia's death was not a simple accident, but a calculated act of vengeance. Among the scattered bake sale remnants lay a crumpled note, barely legible, that read, "The truth will die with me." This cryptic message stirred fear among the ladies of the local gardening club, who had been particularly close to Amelia in recent months. Clara Dawkins, the club president, seemed unusually composed, her eyes flickering with something unspoken. As the inspector made his inquiries, he learned of a curious incident that had shaken the village a month earlier, the return of Margaret Holt, the prodigal daughter of the town's wealthiest family, who had left under a cloud of scandal a decade prior. Margaret's reappearance at the gardening club's annual luncheon had sparked a flurry of gossip, especially after Amelia had publicly embraced her, much to the surprise of the others, who still held grudges from the past. As the inspector interviewed the remaining club members, a tangled web of hidden resentments began to unravel. Margaret, it turned out, had once been engaged to Clara's late brother Harold, but had broken off the engagement just days before his untimely death, a fall from the church belfry that had been ruled an accident. Clara never forgave Margaret, and her return had reignited old wounds. But Amelia's connection was even more surprising. Margaret had confided in her, revealing that Harold's death was not accidental. He had discovered a secret about Clara, one that involved embezzling funds from the parish charity. Harold had threatened to expose her, and just days later he had died. Margaret, fearing for her own safety, had fled the village, leaving behind a whirlwind of speculation. Amelia, guilt-ridden for keeping Margaret's secret for so long, had recently urged her to come forward and clear Harold's name. The inspector's suspicions grew when he noticed that Clara had prepared the very preserves that had poisoned Amelia. Pressing her for answers, he learned that Clara had overheard Amelia and Margaret's hushed conversation at the club's last meeting. Realizing that the truth was about to resurface, Clara had acted out of desperation. Confronted with the evidence, Clara finally broke down, admitting to poisoning the jam, hoping to silence Amelia before she could expose the truth. She had convinced herself that Harold's death was an accident, until Amelia's words rekindled the fear that someone might still uncover her involvement. As Clara was led away, Margaret stood alone in the town square, haunted by the years she had spent running from a truth that had refused to remain buried. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the inspector gently closed the church doors, reflecting on how betrayal and regret had poisoned not just a single jar of jam, but the very heart of the community. In the quaint village of Millfield, where gossip flowed as freely as the river winding through the hills, life had always moved at a comfortable pace. That was until the mourning old Mrs. Hartley was found lifeless at her writing desk, her hand clutching a crumpled water-stained letter. The letter was addressed to no one, its ink smeared, but the words betrayal, forgiveness, and secret remained legible, casting a chilling shadow over the sunlit room. Detective Amelia Rhodes was called in from the nearby town, her keen mind and patient demeanor contrasting with the villagers' collective unease. The sewing circle, a tight-knit group of elderly women known more for their tea and chatter than anything sinister, suddenly found themselves at the heart of whispered speculations. Mrs. Hartley had been their unofficial matriarch, guiding needlework and conversation alike. Who would want to harm such a gentle soul? Amelia sensed the truth lay buried, not in the village square, but within the circle itself, where the women now seemed more guarded, their smiles forced, eyes avoiding one another. She started with Mrs. Primrose, whose trembling hands and downcast gaze betrayed more than just grief. "We argued, yes," Primrose admitted, folding and unfolding her apron, "but it was nothing serious, just a difference of opinion about an old matter." Amelia pressed further, and fragments of an old rivalry surfaced, something about Mrs. Hartley uncovering an ancient deed, one that questioned the rightful ownership of the Hartley estate. It was a scandal long buried, one that could ruin legacies and stir resentment. As Amelia traced the paper trail, she learned that the estate had originally belonged to another family, one with a tragic past. Rumors hinted that Mrs. Hartley had found proof of an illicit affair that intertwined the bloodlines, challenging the Hartleys' claim. The circle's members, it turned out, had deeper ties to the lost family than anyone suspected. Late one evening, Amelia found Mrs. Whitcomb lingering by the old well, muttering about debts owed and sins forgiven. Whitcomb's husband had once been accused of theft, a crime dismissed for lack of evidence, but whispered about for years. Amelia wondered if Mrs. Hartley's discoveries had threatened to drag that scandal back into the light. As secrets unspooled like frayed thread, one name kept surfacing: Eliza Whitewood, the newest member of the circle, whose presence had stirred unease from the start. Amelia uncovered that Eliza was the granddaughter of the woman who had once lived in the Hartley estate, a woman wronged and shunned, forced to leave under a veil of disgrace. Confronting Eliza, Amelia found herself facing not just a grieving granddaughter, but a woman driven by a relentless need to reclaim her family's honor. Eliza broke down, revealing that Mrs. Hartley had promised to set things right, to publicly acknowledge the wrongful eviction, but before she could, she had suddenly changed her mind. She said it wasn't worth ruining lives over, Eliza whispered, her voice tight with anger and regret. The night Mrs. Hartley died, Eliza had visited, demanding answers, but left when the older woman insisted that forgiveness was more important than vengeance. Yet someone else had been listening, someone who couldn't afford the truth to come out. Amelia turned her attention to Mrs. Primrose once more, noticing how the woman's anxiety had grown since Eliza's confession. A missing brooch, last seen in Mrs. Hartley's possession, surfaced in Primrose's sewing kit, tarnished and scratched as if hastily hidden. Realizing the significance, Amelia pieced together the truth. Primrose, fearful of the scandal's revival, and the loss of her late husband's good name, had gone to plead with Mrs. Hartley to keep quiet. In the heat of the argument, a push, a sudden fall, Mrs. Hartley's frail heart had given out. Panicked, Primrose had forged the letter, hoping to redirect suspicion toward Eliza's grievances. When the truth broke, the circle fractured, unable to reconcile the reality with their years of friendship and loyalty. In the end, Amelia reflected that betrayal often grows not from hatred, but from desperation, where the fear of losing one's standing can overshadow the bonds of loyalty. As Millfield settled back into its routine, the sewing circle remained, but with fewer members and a deeper understanding of the price of secrets. The quiet village of Millstone had always held its secrets close, but the air now seemed thicker with tension after the news of Mrs. Devereux's tragic death. She was found floating face down in the lily pond of her garden, her pale hands clutching a delicate frayed piece of lace. The discovery sent ripples through the community, where even the most stoic faces couldn't hide their unease. As whispers of foul play swirled through the cobbled streets, people began to reflect on the recent events at the sewing circle. Mrs. Devereux had been one of the quieter members, often glancing nervously over her shoulder when conversations turned to the past. Miss Fay, who ran the village bakery, recalled how Mrs. Devereux had been oddly distracted that morning, mumbling about old mistakes and secrets best kept buried. Some insisted that guilt had driven her to despair, that her conscience had finally broken under the weight of some unspoken sin. Others, however, suspected darker motives. Detective Eliza Harrington arrived quietly, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with a practiced calm. As she examined the pond's edge, she noticed two distinct sets of footprints, one leading to the water, and another, larger pair heading back toward the house. Eliza's gaze sharpened, the puzzle already taking shape in her mind. Was it truly a desperate suicide, or had Mrs. Devereux been lured to the water's edge, met by someone she trusted, only to be pushed in when her guard was down? The lace itself intrigued her, a fragment from an old handcrafted shawl Mrs. Devereux had worn at the circle only weeks before. The pattern, unique and unmistakable, seemed to tie the present tragedy to something far older, a thread reaching back to when Margaret Ellison vanished without a trace 2 decades ago. As Eliza pieced together the fragments of gossip and strained conversations, a pattern began to emerge. Mrs. Devereux had been asking questions lately, especially about Margaret's disappearance. Had her curiosity struck a nerve in someone desperate to keep the past buried? The villagers, once tight-lipped, now seemed more anxious, some suddenly leaving town for business, or claiming illness to avoid the circle's meetings. As the sun dipped low, Eliza found herself retracing the footsteps around the pond, noticing how the grass was flattened in places, suggesting a struggle, a brief but fierce resistance. The chill in the air seemed to whisper of betrayal and long-held resentment. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who among the villagers had something to lose if the truth resurfaced? She recalled Mrs. Devereux's last words to Miss Fay. If only I'd never started looking. Was it regret or fear that had driven her to seek answers? Or had someone caught wind of her quiet investigation and decided to silence her before more questions could be asked? The villagers' muted conversations grew louder, speculations flying, but Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was too eager to embrace the suicide theory. It felt too neat, too easily accepted by those who should have known better. As the evening stretched on, she returned to the sewing circle, where the remaining members gathered in hushed unease. Her keen eyes scanned their faces, noting the tension, the way hands trembled over needles, and how one member in particular avoided her gaze, a member who had once been close to Margaret, and seemed unusually relieved by Mrs. Devereux's death. Eliza's instincts flared, but she remained quiet, letting the circle's chatter fill the room. She needed more, a slip of the tongue, a careless word. One thing was certain, the truth had not drowned with Mrs. Devereux. It lingered in the wary eyes and uneasy laughter of those left behind. And as the night deepened, Eliza knew that unearthing the secret of the lace would lead her closer to the real killer, someone who had already killed once and wouldn't hesitate to kill again if the past threatened to resurface. In the dim twilight of Ravenswood village, whispers of tragedy crept through the narrow cobbled streets like an unwelcome fog. The serene pond at the village's edge had always been a place of reflection, but now it lay shrouded in grim curiosity. Miss Harriet Granger, the town's quiet seamstress, was found lifeless by its murky banks, her hands twisted around a tattered ribbon, as if in a desperate final message. The ribbon's faded blue color stirred a memory within Miss Eliza Hawthorne, the village's self-appointed historian, and an amateur sleuth with an uncanny knack for peeling back the layers of deceit. As she discreetly inspected the scene, she couldn't ignore the pattern of flattened grass, hinting at a struggle. A trail of muddy footprints, too broad and deliberate to belong to Harriet, crisscrossed the edge, vanishing into the forest. The local constable, eager to conclude the matter, leaned toward the notion of a tragic accident, citing Harriet's supposed melancholy after the recent fire that claimed her small shop. Yet Eliza's intuition warned her of a darker truth. Harriet, known for her meticulous nature, would never have ventured to the pond without reason. The ribbon, its distinctive blue shade, had been part of a dress from the old tailor's shop, one that Harriet had crafted for Clara Morton, a young woman who vanished 5 years prior after a scandalous elopement. As the village buzzed with rumors, Tom Pritchard, a gruff handyman with a drinking problem, abruptly confessed. He claimed that Harriet had confronted him about an unpaid debt, and that in a fit of drunken rage he had pushed her. The townsfolk, weary of lingering mysteries, latched onto his story, relieved to file away another dark chapter. Yet Eliza remained skeptical, noting Tom's hesitant recounting and his visible discomfort whenever the village councilman, Reginald Phelps, loomed nearby. With each passing day, Eliza quietly gathered more clues, overheard whispers of secret meetings, a hasty exchange of coins behind the old inn, and Tom's unease when the topic of Clara's disappearance surfaced. It wasn't long before Eliza discovered that Reginald had funded Tom's gambling debts for years. Her suspicions solidified when she traced the blue ribbon back to Clara's last known dress, one Reginald had commissioned for her birthday. The conclusion chilled her. Harriet had uncovered something damning about Clara's fate, something linking Reginald to the long-buried scandal. As Eliza pieced together the threads, she realized the ribbon had been more than a memento. It was a clue, one that Harriet had grasped onto in her final moments. Confronting Reginald would be risky, but Eliza knew that behind the councilman's polished smile lay a ruthless need to protect his reputation. One evening, as shadows stretched across the village square, Eliza approached him with quiet resolve, hinting at her suspicions. The councilman's eyes flashed with a momentary panic before his practiced composure returned. But it was enough. Eliza had seen through the veneer, and now she only needed to find the final proof. a proof hidden not just in Harriet's last moments, but in the echoes of Clara's forgotten tragedy. In the quaint but gossip-riddled village of Ashford, whispers of scandal swirled around the sudden and tragic death of Edith Millstone, the once beloved matron of the old quilting circle. Her lifeless body was discovered slumped in her own parlor, clutching a faded silk scarf embroidered with the initials, C. The news spread like wildfire, and while the constable leaned toward the notion of a natural death, citing Edith's frail health and advanced age, Agnes Winfield, a keen-eyed widow with a flair for uncovering buried secrets, couldn't dismiss the peculiar circumstances. The scarf itself had a story, once a prized possession of Claire Burrows, a spirited woman who vanished a decade ago after a notorious love triangle that had set the village alight with speculation. Agnes, feigning a need for sewing supplies, ambled to the village haberdashery, where Mrs. Pratt, the shopkeeper, prattled on about old times. Between thimbles and threads, she casually mentioned how Edith and Claire had once been inseparable, until Claire's sudden departure and the ugly rumors that followed. Mrs. Pratt whispered about the quilting circle's unspoken rule, never mention Claire, for it brought bad luck. Intrigued, Agnes paid a visit to the Rosewood Tea Room, where two of Edith's closest acquaintances, Mildred Harper and Ethel Green, were embroiled in a hushed argument. Agnes, always the master of subtlety, eased into their conversation with a remark about the upcoming church fundraiser, and soon the women's defenses lowered. They spoke in fragments, hinting that Edith had recently revived interest in an old letter, one Claire had left behind. As they sipped their tea, Mildred let slip that the letter contained a confession, but of what, neither seemed sure. Ethel, nervously twisting her handkerchief, muttered something about debts and a quarrel, then clammed up when Agnes pressed further. That evening, during the parish meeting, Agnes took note of Mrs. Pratt's peculiar behavior, her fingers fidgeting with the same scarf design that Edith had been clutching. It wasn't long before Agnes realized that the quilting circle harbored more than just fond memories. It concealed a history of rivalry, jealousy, and betrayal. As dusk fell, Agnes strolled through the garden, where Edith's favorite roses grew, and there, half buried in the soil, she found a small wooden box. Inside lay the original letter, crumpled but legible. Its contents spoke of a secret marriage between Claire and a man of high standing, one who could not afford the scandal. The next morning, Agnes confronted Mildred, whose trembling hands betrayed her guilt. It turned out that Edith had threatened to reveal the marriage to the village, hoping to right a wrong done to her dear friend. Mildred, desperate to protect her own reputation, had confronted Edith, leading to a heated argument, and the unfortunate fall that claimed Edith's life. Agnes handed the letter to the constable, her suspicions confirmed. As the villagers mourned Edith, Agnes couldn't help but feel that justice had finally been served, but the legacy of Claire Burrows would remain a whispered legend, one that the quilting circle would never dare to revisit. In the close-knit village of Little Haddington, where secrets were often whispered rather than spoken, the tragic death of Violet Ramsay sent shockwaves through the community. Found lifeless in her drawing room, her face a mask of serene finality, Violet's death was ruled a natural one at first glance. Yet, for Beatrice Ashcroft, an unassuming yet perceptive widow, known for her uncanny ability to notice the unseen, the situation felt far from ordinary. It wasn't the way Violet lay, nor the half-empty teacup beside her, but rather the peculiar locket clutched tightly in her hand, its clasp broken, as if ripped from someone's neck. Beatrice, with her quiet demeanor and an almost invisible presence, made her rounds through the village, subtly gathering fragments of information. The gossip was already brewing at the bakery, where Mrs. Henshaw whispered to anyone who would listen that Violet had been acting strangely of late, muttering about old grievances and meeting someone after dark. Beatrice nodded along, purchasing her scones while mentally noting every word. Later that afternoon, at the village green, she struck up a conversation with Edith Pine, a former housemaid to the Ramsay household, who hinted at an old love affair that had once scandalized the community. Violet and Edwin Thornton, the local magistrate. According to Edith, their romance had been a brief but passionate affair, one that ended abruptly when Violet married Rupert Ramsay, a man of solid, if somewhat dull, reputation. Yet, Edith let slip that Edwin and Violet's connection never truly faded, for even after Rupert's untimely passing, Edwin was seen visiting the Ramsay estate late into the night. Intrigued, Beatrice decided to delve deeper, recalling that Rupert's death, though attributed to a heart condition, had seemed sudden. A visit to the village apothecary yielded more unsettling whispers. Violet had, only days before her death, purchased a vial of laudanum, claiming it was to soothe her restless nights. Beatrice's mind raced with possibilities: a tormented conscience, a rekindled love, or perhaps something darker. Her instincts pushed her towards the churchyard, where she encountered Martha Gray, an elderly woman known for her long memory and sharp tongue. Martha, warming her hands over the brazier, spoke cautiously about the night Rupert died, recounting how she'd seen Edwin leaving the estate, looking troubled and pale. That same night, a quarrel had erupted, and Rupert's cries had echoed through the quiet village. Beatrice pressed for more, but Martha, wary of stirring old wounds, fell silent. That evening, as the village gathered for the Lantern Festival, Beatrice spotted Edwin himself, standing apart, his shoulders hunched. Summoning her courage, she approached him, striking up a conversation about old times. When she gently mentioned Violet's sudden passing, Edwin's face tightened, and his hand trembled slightly as he claimed to have been away during her final hours. Beatrice caught the lie, a small but telling one, for she knew from Martha's recollection that Edwin had been seen just before Violet's death. Pondering the timeline, Beatrice realized that Edwin's frequent visits had not been to rekindle love, but to keep Violet silent, for she had recently discovered something, perhaps about Rupert's death, that threatened to unravel his respectable position. The locket, bearing Edwin's initials, was the final piece of the puzzle. Beatrice understood that Violet had planned to confront him, demanding the truth, and in a moment of desperation, Edwin had silenced her just as he had Rupert. Her suspicions confirmed. Beatrice notified the constable, who despite his initial skepticism, found traces of laudanum not only in Violet's cup, but also in the remnants of Rupert's old medicine vial. Confronted, Edwin broke down, confessing to both deaths, driven by jealousy and fear of losing his standing. As the villagers processed the shocking truth, Beatrice, ever composed, couldn't help but reflect on the fragile line between love and obsession, and how in the quietest of places, the darkest secrets often lay hidden in plain sight. The small village of Everdale was steeped in age-old secrets, whispered tales of betrayals, and hushed scandals that had long since faded into the shadows. Yet, one stormy night, a haunting event, thrust those buried stories back into the spotlight. Miss Eleanor Clark, the village's quiet yet perceptive seamstress, found herself at the center of a disturbing discovery. As she stitched a hem by the dim glow of her parlor lamp, her thoughts wandered to the recent tragedy, the sudden and inexplicable death of the town's matriarch, Mrs. Winifred Hart. Gossip had fluttered around the village like restless birds, but it wasn't until Eleanor found a peculiar letter tucked inside an old sewing pattern that suspicion truly took root. The letter, dated years ago, was addressed to a woman named Margaret, who had vanished without a trace one fateful autumn night. The words were hastily written, almost frantic, speaking of a betrayal too immense to forgive, and a meeting at the old chapel on the edge of town. As Eleanor read, the chilling realization dawned on her that Margaret's disappearance might have been no accident. The very next day, a second tragedy struck. Miss Lillian Baxter, Winifred's closest friend, was found lifeless in her garden, her hands clasped tightly around a locket engraved with the initials, M.H. Eleanor couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that the past was bleeding into the present. Determined to unravel the truth, she visited the Hart estate, where she overheard the gardener muttering about a secret affair between Margaret and Winifred's husband, Edgar. A scandalous love triangle, or something darker. Eleanor pressed on, her every step shadowed by the creeping fear that someone was watching her, waiting for her to uncover too much. It was during a tense conversation with the elderly groundskeeper that Eleanor unearthed a crucial piece of the puzzle, a diary once belonging to Margaret, hidden beneath the floorboards of the chapel. The diary spoke of promises and threats, of a love that turned to obsession, and a secret so explosive that Margaret had planned to leave town forever, but she never did. Eleanor's heart raced as she connected the dots, Could Edgar have silenced Margaret to protect his reputation, or was Winifred the one to exact vengeance on a rival lover? As night fell, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in. Returning to her cottage, she found the windows ajar, the pages of Margaret's diary strewn across the floor, and a single rose placed on her sewing table, a rose identical to the ones in Mrs. Hart's prized garden. Someone wanted Eleanor to know they were watching. Gathering her courage, she pieced together the final clue. The last entry in the diary spoke of a confrontation at the chapel, a place where secrets went to die. Determined to end the cycle of fear, Eleanor made her way there under the cloak of darkness. As she approached, a shadow emerged from the doorway, and a familiar voice whispered, "Some truths should never be unearthed." The final revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Lillian had known the secret all along, but instead of exposing it, she had used it to manipulate Winifred, forcing her to keep quiet by threatening to reveal Edgar's infidelity. When Margaret threatened to expose the truth, Lillian eliminated her, and years later, when Winifred could no longer live with the guilt, she too was silenced. As Eleanor's thoughts raced, the figure moved closer, but in the last moment, the village constable appeared, drawn by Eleanor's earlier cryptic note, asking for help. The truth came spilling out, and Lillian, seeing her web of lies unravel, tried to flee but was caught. As dawn broke, Eleanor stood at the chapel steps, the weight of generations of lies finally lifted. Yet, in the still morning air, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that some stories remained untold, waiting for the next storm to stir them to life once more. As the evening shadows stretched across the village, Miss Marlowe sat in the fading light of her parlor, the newly discovered letter trembling in her hands. It was as if Margaret herself had reached out from the past, leaving behind a fragile thread of truth, a desperate plea, or perhaps a warning wrapped in guilt. The faint, hurried handwriting spoke of a love too intense to be concealed, and a fear too profound to ignore. Margaret had planned to escape, to leave behind the suffocating scrutiny of the village, the whispers, and the judgment, and begin a new life driven by passion and reckless hope. The letter revealed her intention to elope with a lover whose identity remained tantalizingly elusive. Yet, woven through the declarations of love was an unmistakable undertone of dread, a realization that someone had uncovered her plan, someone who did not intend to let her slip away so easily. Miss Marlowe folded the letter carefully, her thoughts racing. The very idea that Margaret had felt so trapped, enough to risk everything for freedom, painted a picture far more tragic than anyone had ever imagined. But what truly unsettled her was the chilling implication that someone within Margaret's closest circle had discovered the secret and acted with malicious intent. Had this forbidden romance threatened more than just reputation? Could it have shattered carefully constructed lies, exposed buried truths, or unraveled relationships that had long since decayed? The more Miss Marlowe considered it, the more sinister the circumstances appeared. If the planned elopement had been thwarted, it could mean that Margaret had been intercepted before she ever reached her lover. The thought of a shadowy figure waiting in the dark, eyes gleaming with betrayal or vengeance, set Miss Marlowe's mind ablaze with speculation. The letter's date matched the night of Margaret's sudden disappearance, an uncanny coincidence that felt too calculated to dismiss. Who had the most to lose if Margaret had succeeded in fleeing? And why would someone take such drastic measures to ensure her silence? She thought back to the sewing circle, a group bound not just by friendship but by secrets guarded with ferocious loyalty. A fleeting memory surfaced, an overheard conversation long ago about loyalty, love and the cost of betrayal. Was it possible that someone within the circle had orchestrated the perfect crime under the guise of social decorum? As Miss Marlowe traced the delicate script with a trembling finger, she couldn't shake the feeling that the village had never truly healed from Margaret's vanishing. Perhaps it wasn't just the pain of loss that lingered, but the weight of unresolved guilt. Miss Marlowe's mind turned to the recent murders, the violent ends met by Mrs. Hargreaves and Mrs. Pettigrew. Was there a connection? Did they know too much, or had they been complicit in covering up Margaret's fate? It was possible that someone had struck again, driven by the fear that Margaret's secret would finally be revealed after all these years. The thought chilled Miss Marlowe to her core. The killer could still be among them, watching, waiting and prepared to strike again if threatened. She knew that the next step would be delicate. Too much pressure could provoke the culprit to act out once more, but doing nothing could mean more lives lost. As she tucked the letter safely into her journal, Miss Marlowe resolved to revisit the sewing circle's past with sharper eyes, seeking out the overlooked details, the veiled glances, and the fleeting moments of tension. The truth was buried deep, wrapped in years of complacency and fear, but Miss Marlowe was determined to unearth it, no matter the cost. The clock was ticking, and every second brought the killer closer to securing their dark legacy once more. That night, Miss Marlowe sat in her dimly lit study, her mind whirling with unsettling possibilities. The air felt heavy, as if weighed down by the remnants of a decades-old secret, creeping back to haunt the village once more. She couldn't shake the image of Margaret, poised on the edge of freedom, only to have her dreams shattered by a figure lurking in the dark. Who had stopped her? Was it driven by a personal vendetta, an obsessive need to protect family honor, or something far more sinister? Miss Marlowe's intuition warned her that the same unseen hand that had thwarted Margaret's escape years ago was now reaching out again, this time with deadly intent. The calculated interference on that fateful night wasn't just a matter of chance, it was deliberate, cold, precise, and calculated. Miss Marlowe could feel the connection between past and present winding tighter, like a noose around the truth. As her thoughts unfolded, a sharp rap at the door broke the stillness. A neighbor stood on the threshold, her face pale and voice trembling. News had spread. Another act of violence had erupted in the village. Mrs. Fanshawe, a long-time member of the sewing circle and keeper of whispered secrets, had been attacked in her cottage. The assault had been swift, a brutal blow from behind, as if someone had crept in silently, striking before she even had the chance to scream. Miss Marlowe listened intently, noting every detail. The neighbor mentioned that Mrs. Fanshawe, the badly hurt, had muttered something about a warning, a message received just the day before, hinting that digging into Margaret's past would only bring trouble. Miss Marlowe felt a cold shiver race down her spine. The timing of the attack, so soon after the unsent letter surfaced, was no coincidence. Someone was determined to keep Margaret's secrets buried, even if it meant silencing anyone who dared to uncover the truth. Miss Marlowe carefully gathered her thoughts, piecing together the sequence of events. It wasn't just about Margaret's forbidden love or a thwarted elopement. It was about a deeper conspiracy rooted in betrayal and guarded fiercely through the years. The attacker was no impulsive ruffian, but a meticulous planner who understood the significance of the resurfaced letter. Later that evening, Miss Marlowe made her way to Mrs. Fanshawe's cottage, where the injured woman lay weak but conscious. With a calm and gentle voice, Miss Marlowe questioned her, careful not to pressure but guiding her words with a quiet insistence. Mrs. Fanshawe, through labored breaths, whispered about a visitor from her past, someone who had always been wary of Margaret's choices, and fiercely protective of the family's reputation. But when pressed to reveal the name, Mrs. Fanshawe froze, eyes wide with a fear that spoke volumes. Miss Marlowe realized that the fear of the past had never truly left the village. It remained like a ghost, waiting for the slightest hint of exposure to strike back. As she wrapped Mrs. Fanshawe's injured hand, Miss Marlowe could sense the presence of danger lurking just beyond the window, a threat not confined to the past but very much alive. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Anyone who dared to look too closely into Margaret's story faced the risk of being silenced. The assailant, whoever they were, was willing to go to any lengths to ensure that the truth remained hidden. Miss Marlowe's resolve hardened. She couldn't ignore the growing list of victims connected to Margaret's secret. Someone was trying to manipulate the narrative, erasing key witnesses, and keeping the dark truth locked away. As the evening deepened into night, Miss Marlowe sat by the flickering lamp, her thoughts tracing back to the sewing circle, a seemingly innocent gathering that harbored bitter resentments and buried grudges. She knew that the circle's intricate web of relationships held the answer, but to untangle it would require skill, patience, and a willingness to confront truths long denied. Miss Marlowe was determined to see it through, even if it meant unearthing the most uncomfortable realities. The village might fear the past, but she knew that facing it was the only way to break the chain of violence that had started with Margaret's tragic disappearance and continued to haunt them still. That evening Miss Marlowe sat in her cozy parlor, sipping tea while her mind wrestled with the elusive truth. She couldn't help but wonder if the person responsible for the violence was one of the original sewing circle members, someone so entrenched in fear and guilt that they would go to any lengths to keep Margaret's secret buried. The legacy of that fateful night, when Margaret's future had vanished, hung over the village like a dark cloud. Miss Marlowe knew that behind the polite smiles and practiced hospitality lay a grim determination to protect the past, no matter the cost. The scandal of Margaret's thwarted elopement, and the truth of what really happened, threatened to unravel decades of carefully guarded secrets. With quiet determination, Miss Marlowe set her plan in motion. She arranged a gathering at the vicarage, using the pretext of discussing a village charity project. One by one the surviving members of the old sewing circle filed in, their faces lined with age, but still holding traces of the vibrant women they once were. The room seemed to thicken with tension, as the women exchanged guarded greetings. Though their words were polite, Miss Marlowe noted the reluctance lurking behind their practiced smiles. Each knew this meeting was not just another social gathering. Miss Marlowe's demeanor remained calm and composed, but her perceptive eyes missed nothing. As the women settled into their seats, she could sense the invisible weight of shared guilt and old resentments hanging heavily in the air. The vicarage, known for its simple charm and welcoming atmosphere, had transformed into a quiet battleground, where long-buried truths were poised to resurface. With each carefully chosen word, Miss Marlowe steered the conversation, allowing it to drift from everyday matters to subtle hints of the past. The women responded cautiously, their voices tinged with apprehension. When Miss Marlowe finally broached the topic of Margaret, the atmosphere shifted. She spoke softly, her tone encouraging reflection rather than confrontation. "Do you remember that evening?" she asked, her eyes moving from face to face. The women hesitated, glancing at one another, as if silently debating how much to reveal. Miss Marlowe's patience was unwavering. One by one they began to share fragmented memories, an overheard argument, a fleeting glimpse of Margaret through a rain-streaked window, the tense silence that had settled after her disappearance. As they spoke, Miss Marlowe watched their expressions, noting how some seemed almost relieved to speak while others remained rigid, guarding their words as if one wrong move could shatter the fragile peace they had maintained. A pattern began to emerge, a web of half-truths and omissions interwoven with glances that betrayed more than their words. One woman recalled a figure hurrying away from the garden that night, but when pressed, claimed it might have been a trick of the light. Another mentioned an unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong, but couldn't quite put it into words. Miss Marlowe listened with the intensity of a hunter following a scent. She knew that guilt and fear had their own language, spoken not through bold confessions, but through subtle hesitations and evasive answers. As the meeting progressed, she sensed that the real story wasn't just about Margaret's vanished future, it was about betrayal, a decision made long ago, driven by a fear that had never truly faded. The sewing circle, once a place of companionship, had become a fortress of silence, each member sworn to protect a secret that had already claimed too many lives. As the conversation circled back to safer topics, Miss Marlowe knew she had unearthed something crucial. The truth was there, concealed beneath layers of denial and mutual protection. She needed to dig deeper, but not by force. She would continue to unravel the threads, one conversation at a time, until the truth lay bare. The village could no longer hide behind its well-worn traditions and whispered assurances. Miss Marlowe's quiet resolve remained unshaken. She would see this mystery through, no matter how tightly the past tried to hold its grip. Miss Marlowe leaned back slightly, her thoughtful gaze never wavering as the stories began to unravel, each woman's voice quivering with the weight of memories they had desperately tried to bury. The room seemed to pulse with a collective unease, like a festering wound exposed to the harsh light of day. Slowly, the fragmented accounts of that fateful night began to coalesce, revealing a picture tinged with fear, jealousy, and irreversible actions. Whispers, edged with regret, suggested that Mrs. Hargreaves, once known for her proud and resolute nature, had reached a breaking point when confronted with Margaret's bold intentions. One of the women, her voice barely a whisper, recounted how Mrs. Hargreaves had erupted in a sudden uncontrollable fury, a torrent of long-simmering emotions brought to a boil. It was as if a dam had burst, and in that fleeting, chaotic moment, Margaret had been the tragic recipient of that unleashed rage. The suggestion that Margaret had been pushed, violently, fatally, hung heavy in the room, though no one dared utter it outright. Miss Marlowe's calm, observant demeanor never faltered, though she noted how each woman seemed to tread carefully around the truth, their words hinting at jealousy transformed into something unspeakable. The collective breath of the room seemed to hold as the idea took root that the confrontation had not been a mere accident, but the tragic culmination of a bitterness nurtured over years. It was not just about that one night, but about an undercurrent of rivalry that had simmered beneath the surface for far too long. One by one, the women shared faint recollections, an overheard argument, a glimpse of Mrs. Hargreaves' ashen face as she stormed past, the eerie quiet that followed. They spoke not in accusations but in hints, as if too afraid to directly confront the reality that one of their own could have harbored such deadly intentions. Amidst the subdued revelations, Miss Marlowe discerned an unspoken agreement, an unyielding pact forged out of fear and loyalty. After Margaret's disappearance, it seemed that a silent consensus had bound the sewing circle together, a pact never formally acknowledged but deeply rooted in their collective psyche. One woman, her hands trembling, murmured how they had all agreed, implicitly, to let the past remain buried, to silence any lingering doubts or accusations for the sake of preserving their reputations. The words were tinged with guilt, an echo of a shared fear that unraveling the truth would destroy more than just memories, it would rip apart the fabric of their lives. Miss Marlowe, perceptive and unrelenting, noticed how Mrs. Pettigrew's gaze remained fixed on her hands, her knuckles white with the pressure of holding on to something too painful to release. A fleeting broken sentence hinted at how Mrs. Pettigrew, weighed down by her conscience, had almost spoken up years ago, but had been silenced by fear, by loyalty, or by the overwhelming certainty that speaking out would ruin them all. It was clear that Mrs. Pettigrew's near confession had been swiftly smothered by the others, their collective fear that the truth could shatter their carefully preserved lives. The silence that had followed Margaret's disappearance had been more than just a decision to protect Mrs. Hargreaves, it had been an agreement to protect themselves, to seal away the night's darkness, and continue as though nothing had changed. But Miss Marlowe could see that the pact had never truly faded, it had merely grown more suffocating over the years, its weight pressing down on their souls. Now, faced with the relentless pursuit of truth, the once strong thread of their shared silence was beginning to fray. Miss Marlowe knew that breaking this vow would not just release the truth, but would shatter the lives built on that buried secret. Yet, with every hesitant word and every faltering glance, the undeniable reality loomed closer, one that threatened to unravel the sewing circle's unity and reveal the dark legacy they had all silently sworn to protect. The room was thick with unease as Miss Marlowe continued to listen, her keen eyes fixed on the women before her. One hesitant voice, softer than a breath, finally dared to reveal what had been gnawing at the group for years. Mrs. Pettigrew, burdened by guilt and weary from the relentless weight of secrecy, had been on the brink of a confession. One of the women recalled in a tremulous whisper how Mrs. Pettigrew had reached a breaking point, her conscience too burdened to carry the truth alone any longer. She was ready to speak, the woman murmured, glancing around as if fearful the very walls might betray her words. Miss Marlowe, perceptive as ever, did not miss how the other women exchanged glances, a flicker of panic veiled by practiced composure. The atmosphere grew denser, more suffocating, as the realization crept in. Mrs. Pettigrew's sudden death had not been a mere twist of fate. Miss Marlowe's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of uncertainty with the precision of a master detective. The timing was too convenient, too precise. What if Mrs. Pettigrew had not simply died of natural causes, but had been silenced to preserve the group's dark secret, a deliberate act, disguised as tragic misfortune? The mere thought of it sent a chill through the room, but no one dared voice it outright, as if acknowledging it would make it irrevocably real. Miss Marlowe's instincts whispered of a cover-up, a plan meticulously executed to prevent Mrs. Pettigrew from unburdening her soul. When the final reluctant truths came to light, the sewing circle, once a symbol of unity and sisterhood, lay fractured, like a mirror shattered into countless irreparable shards. The weight of their collective guilt, once hidden beneath the guise of companionship, now seeped through the cracks. Their stories, woven with half-truths and omissions, had unraveled to expose the festering guilt at the heart of their secret. Some sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the floor, while others dabbed at tears, unsure whether they were mourning their friend's death or the loss of the community they once cherished. Miss Marlowe could sense the profound shift in the air, the silent understanding that nothing would ever be the same. They had spent years stitching together a lie, and now, with the threads coming undone, they found themselves wrapped in a suffocating quilt of remorse. With the formal investigation closed, Miss Marlowe could not ignore the lingering sense of something unfinished. She made her way to Mrs. Fanshaw's modest cottage, her footsteps purposeful yet quiet, as if not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled. Mrs. Fanshaw greeted her with a strained politeness, her voice steady but lacking warmth. Miss Marlowe, never one to shy away from uncomfortable truths, spoke with a calm yet probing tone, her questions gentle but relentless. There was something in Mrs. Fanshaw's eyes, a guardedness that didn't match her words. The conversation flowed in a calculated rhythm, each response measured and cautious. It wasn't just what Mrs. Fanshaw said, it was how she said it. Her answers seemed rehearsed, polished to perfection, as though she had spent sleepless nights preparing for this very encounter. Miss Marlowe's sharp mind caught the subtle inconsistencies, the way Mrs. Fanshaw's hands trembled when she spoke of Mrs. Pettigrew's last days. Leaning in slightly, Miss Marlowe posed a simple, disarming question: did you come back to seek the truth, or to bury it? The inquiry hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Mrs. Fanshaw hesitated, her eyes briefly betraying a flicker of guilt before her composure returned. She muttered something about wanting closure, but Miss Marlowe knew better. The woman had not returned out of grief, or a desire for justice. She had come to ensure the silence remained intact. Miss Marlowe's probing continued, her words gentle but persistent, peeling away the layers of deception. It became evident that Mrs. Fanshaw's initial portrayal as a concerned friend had been a calculated performance. Beneath that veneer of sorrow and sympathy lay a more sinister intent, a desire to maintain the status quo, to ensure that Mrs. Pettigrew's final words remained buried along with her. Miss Marlowe's perceptive nature honed in on Mrs. Fanshaw's tightly wound composure, the forced calm of a woman too accustomed to guarding secrets. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Miss Marlowe understood that the tragedy of Margaret's death had not ended with that fateful night. It had continued to poison the lives of those who chose silence over truth. The true crime lay not just in the act itself, but in the suffocating conspiracy of silence that followed. In that moment, Miss Marlowe knew that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are not the ones whispered in dark alleys, but those guarded by seemingly respectable faces, hiding guilt beneath layers of decorum, pretending that their silence was an act of compassion rather than cowardice. The afternoon sun dipped low behind the dense canopy of trees, casting long wavering shadows on the narrow lane leading to Mrs. Fanshaw's cottage. Miss Marlowe moved with quiet determination, her steps purposeful yet unhurried, as if savoring the stillness that had settled over the village. When she finally reached the cottage, Mrs. Fanshaw was already waiting on the doorstep, her figure outlined against the dim light seeping through the windows. The greeting was cordial but laced with a tension that crackled in the air. Miss Marlowe, ever the astute observer, noted the way Mrs. Fanshaw's fingers fidgeted with the edges of her shawl, a nervous habit betraying the calm exterior she struggled to maintain. Miss Marlowe's questions, though softly spoken, cut through the pleasantries like a knife through butter. As they spoke, it became increasingly apparent that Mrs. Fanshaw was not just a bystander to the tragedy that had unfolded. Her answers were deliberate, each word carefully chosen to obscure more than reveal. Miss Marlowe did not miss the way her voice faltered when questioned about her connection to the old scandal, nor how her gaze shifted when pressed about her purpose in returning to the village after so many years. There was something guarded in her tone, a practiced calm that could not entirely mask the truth lurking beneath. Then, in a moment of subtle brilliance, Miss Marlowe gently steered the conversation to the heart of the matter. "You knew about the scandal long before you returned, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated, a flash of something akin to panic crossing her features before she masked it with a tight-lipped smile. She murmured vague justifications, but Miss Marlowe could see through the ruse. The truth was not shouted or declared with triumphant revelation. Rather, it seeped into the room like a creeping mist, wrapping around them both in an unspoken understanding. Mrs. Fanshawe had not come back to seek solace or to pay respects. She had come armed with knowledge, intending to wield it as leverage. The realization struck Miss Marlowe with quiet certainty. Mrs. Fanshawe had known about the scandal all along, and had planned to use that secret for her own gain. It was not the righteous quest for truth that she had claimed, but a calculated move for blackmail, a game of control disguised as compassion. Miss Marlowe did not confront her with open accusation. Instead, she chose a more measured approach, one befitting the delicate nature of the situation. "It is best," she said in a voice both kind and resolute, "that you leave St. Mary Mead. Sometimes the past, when disturbed, brings more sorrow than its worth." The words, though spoken with gentleness, carried an undeniable firmness, a quiet ultimatum that brooked no argument. Mrs. Fanshawe's response was subdued, her shoulders sinking, as if the weight of her own actions had finally caught up with her. She did not protest, only nodded, the resignation clear in her downcast eyes. Miss Marlowe knew that the decision to let Mrs. Fanshawe leave without public exposure was a calculated one, balancing justice with mercy. After all, the villagers had suffered enough, and sometimes the preservation of peace meant allowing certain truths to remain buried. After Mrs. Fanshawe's departure, Miss Marlowe lingered in the fading light, her mind reflecting on the profound impact of the sewing circle's secrets. Those long-held confidences, whispered under the guise of friendship, had festered into a legacy of betrayal and guilt. The circle had once been a sanctuary for the women of the village, a place where they could share their burdens and find solace. But over time, it had morphed into something darker, a knot of secrecy and silent suffering that had entangled them all. Miss Marlowe could not help but think of how human nature, when left unchecked, could twist even the purest of intentions into something sinister. The tragedy lay not just in the act itself, but in the years of quiet complicity that had followed. The circle, once a place of comfort, had become a trap of silent alliances and buried truths. That evening, as Miss Marlowe made her way home, she noticed a small, subtle change in the village. A new resident had moved into the cottage that Mrs. Fanshawe had vacated, and the sight of fresh curtains fluttering in the windows brought a faint smile to her lips. Life, it seemed, was already moving forward, unbothered by the darkness that had momentarily settled over the village. Miss Marlowe understood that this new arrival signaled the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh story to unfold in the village's endless cycle of lives, intertwined and secrets concealed. As she walked on, the weight of the past gradually lifted, and she knew that the village, resilient as ever, would heal from this latest disturbance, just as it had survived countless others before. In that fleeting moment, she acknowledged that the human spirit, despite its flaws and failings, always finds a way to persist, weaving new stories where old ones have unraveled. In the soft glow of the evening, as the village of St. Mary Mead settled into its usual quiet, Miss Marlowe couldn't help but reflect on the delicate dance between truth and silence. Secrets, once uncovered, rarely lay dormant. Instead, they ripple through lives, weaving new mysteries from the remnants of the old. Mrs. Fanshawe had departed, her intentions unmasked, yet the echo of her presence lingered like a shadow stretching across the village square. Miss Marlowe knew that St. Mary Mead, with its charming cottages and whispering hedgerows, was a place where secrets thrived, cloaked in the guise of neighborly chatter. As the new tenant moved into the vacant cottage, Miss Marlowe found herself wondering if this fresh face would bring peace, or more entanglements. The villagers, eager to know more, cast curious glances at the stranger, their imaginations already weaving tales from the simplest of gestures, a cautious wave, an unfamiliar car parked out front, curtains drawn at odd hours. Miss Marple watched from her window, contemplating the subtle tension that accompanied every new arrival. Memories of the past weeks washed over her, the whispered rumors that had floated through the sewing circle, piecing together fragments of a decades-old scandal. It wasn't just the revelation of Mrs. Fanshaw's motives that had struck Miss Marple, it was the quiet realization of how gossip, like ivy, had crept into the very foundation of the village. No one had questioned the stories spun around kitchen tables, or the secrets shared over a cup of tea. They had accepted them, allowed them to shape perceptions, and in doing so, had chained themselves to the past. Miss Marple understood that the truth wasn't just a matter of facts, it was how those facts were wielded, how they grew like roots, unseen but persistent. She couldn't help but ponder whether the departure of Mrs. Fanshawe marked an end, or merely the start of something else, a story unfinished, threads left hanging, waiting for someone new to pull them. As the night deepened, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the village itself was like an old book, its pages yellowed, edges worn, but stories still waiting to be read. Perhaps the newcomer would write their own chapter, unknowingly stepping into the web of old grudges and unresolved histories. Miss Marple, in her quiet wisdom, knew better than to rush to judgment. Every new story started with an introduction, and this one, with its hints of secrets yet untold, intrigued her. In the solitude of her thoughts, she mused about how life in St. Mary Mead had a way of recycling its own myths, blending the truth and fiction, until it became impossible to separate one from the other. There was something timeless about it, a cycle of discovery and discretion that shaped the village's identity. She knew that while Mrs. Fanshaw's departure signaled the end of one tale, the arrival of someone new marked the beginning of another. It was the way of the village, quietly resilient, always shifting, never quite revealing its heart to anyone completely. Miss Marple felt a shiver of anticipation, not from fear, but from the unspoken thrill of knowing that mysteries never truly ended here, they merely changed form. The past had stirred once more, like leaves rustling in a sudden breeze, and St. Mary Mead remained as it always had, full of secrets, cloaked in charm, waiting for the next unraveling. Before turning in for the night, Miss Marple took one last glance out the window, catching sight of the new tenant arranging flowers in the window, a seemingly innocent gesture. Yet in this village, where the past never truly stayed buried, it was enough to set the wheels of speculation turning once again. As she closed her curtains, Miss Marple couldn't help but smile, a quiet knowing smile that hinted at her readiness to observe whatever lay ahead. She knew all too well that St. Mary Mead's story was far from over, and the village, like the people within it, thrived on the subtle dance between truth and the unknown. The cycle of secrets would continue, shaped by new voices, woven into the tapestry of village life, as enduring and enigmatic as ever.